Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 205. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Thomas R. Weaver about his debut novel, Artificial Wisdom. In this techno-thriller murder mystery, Tom tackles two major issues, climate change and artificial intelligence. He began writing this story by asking the question, what if the global community were to put its faith in an AI leader in a Brexit-style referendum? It is 25 years in the future. The world is polarized by politics and is splitting apart, and the planet is gripped by a combination of crises, war, climate change, and technology that has advanced exponentially. But all of this serves as a backdrop to a very personal and human story that centers around a reporter whose personal tragedy and grief has a direct connection to the crises that plague the global community. In this episode, I'll chat with Tom about his writing journey, why writing his own books has made reading fiction much more difficult for him, and what he means when he says that he and his manuscript drafts underwent a great deal of bouncing and interrogating, as well as a few other things coming up. Thomas R. Weaver, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your debut novel, a techno-thriller called Artificial Wisdom. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Yeah, Artificial Wisdom, I like to call it a murder mystery techno-thriller. And in a way, that's because it's a bit of a genre blend between a bunch of different things, but it started out very much with this idea of a world in which we've all been a bit polarized by, politics and everything else. And this is, by the way, is the inspiration. I was sort of looking around thinking, how is it that we're in a state where we're just splitting apart? You know, we're becoming different nations within the same nation, both in the US and in the UK. And from a political perspective, you could see that actually it's now increasingly possible to convince very large numbers of people to sometimes vote against their own interests. And the big thought that was in my head back in 2020 when I started to write this was, what happens when technology improves and it becomes even easier to convince people to vote against their own interests? That was my genesis for the book. The book itself, I would say, as I say, it's murder mystery techno thriller, but it's got strong themes around artificial intelligence and climate. And, it is looking very much 25 years into the future and trying to imagine what that world is going to be and some of the issues that we're facing today extrapolated into the future.
And let's talk about those issues, because in this book you handle two big issues that we wrestle with today. And so one of those issues would probably be plenty for a book, but you managed to combine both. And I'm curious how you decided that these were the two issues you were going to marry in this book and weave your story with them. And 25 years in the dire is really not that far when you think about it. So it's sort of a near future that looks dire compared to where we are. And so I'm curious, when you married these two issues, climate change and artificial intelligence, what was the thought process behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me address the timeline first because it's a really interesting one. And actually, the very final editor to read my book, a proofreader, came back to me and said, I'm looking at this and I'm just kind of wondering, I feel very uneasy about the fact that you've set this in 2050. It feels to me more like 2070. And what I said back to her and what I said to everybody else is we're kind of used to thinking quite linear in a very linear fashion as a species. We look back at what the last 20, 30 years have been like, and we tend to think that's what the next 20, 30 years are going to be like. We can see a trend line, but we imagine it to be fairly flat. And the thing that's happening right now in both technology in particular, I think we can all see just how rapidly things like artificial intelligence have come on in the last couple of years. We've gone from, I mean, when I started writing the book, ChatGPT and Midjourney and all of these tools that are becoming part of people's daily lives, work lives, they just didn't exist. And that was only a couple of years ago. And now maybe I use ChatGPT instead of Google, for the majority of the things that I'm searching for and doing. So we very much live in exponential times from a technological perspective. And unfortunately, I think we also live in exponential times from a climate perspective as well, because what we tend to see, when you look at the science of some of this, is that issues compound upon each other. And, you'll get multiple things layering on and making things worse. So this isn't meant to be a kind of heavy book that kind of scares people and paralyzes them. In a way, what I wanted to do was the opposite, which was to show them, okay, here's a worst case scenario, and here's what it would take to get us out of that worst case scenario. And maybe that's not the price we want to pay. So, what actions can we take today? What things can we think about doing a little bit differently? Because I do believe that mankind has a terrible habit of leaving it right to the last minute with anything that we face in our daily lives as well as at a species level. I mean, I'm the worst at this, but I just think it's naturally us. We tend to put something off fixing until it's in its worst possible state.
Yeah.
And that didn't answer the beginning of your question, I think, which was which did I decide first? And I actually found a note today, which I'd written 6 months before I started writing the book. I'd forgotten all about it, and it was a very small little note on my phone in the folder, in my notes folder, and it said, "What if civilization splitting apart in polarization puts their fate in an AI leader in a Brexit-style referendum?" And, that was obviously what was going through my head at the time. It was thinking about the political spectrum of it all. And down below it, there's a few other lines exploring it. And I was very much thinking not specifically about climate there, as in, why would we need to get out of some sort of crisis? I was thinking about a combination of crises, both climate, but also war. Because I think we also live in a time where things are a little bit uncertain even on that front. And historically we always go through these periods where things have been nice and safe and secure, and everybody thinks that we're kind of in a post-war era, and then suddenly conflicts erupt that surprise us, that have a risk of spreading like wildfire. And I think we're still in that kind of state as a species, and it's all of our own making. So this was the sort of stuff that was really the genesis of the book.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to talk about the characters, and in doing so, there are five things I want to talk about. The first three are sort of our traditional characters, and then we'll get to the other two. But first off, you have three sort of crucial characters I think we need to understand with respect to this book. Let's deal with the first one, which is Marcus Tully. What do we need to know about him?
So Marcus Tully is my protagonist. He is an investigative reporter, and he is somebody that is suffering from grief. His wife died in the climate disaster 10 years ago, and he's never really gotten over it and doesn't really want to either. He's also someone who has a very strong sense that he is a voice of truth in the world, sometimes to his detriment, but it's something that he believes in very, very strongly. And I would say he would value the truth over the consequence. He would write even if it caused trouble because it's so important to him. And of course, there are reasons for that, which some of which get revealed in the book, some of which don't. But that's very much who he is. I wouldn't say he's the kind of character, very deliberately didn't want him to be a pure kind of hero, a goody goody guy. Like some of the ways that he goes about getting his stories written are questionable. And that was something I felt strongly about from the beginning because I've read up on a number of journalists. I've met some journalists, and sometimes they do have questionable techniques in order to get their stories out. And I just think that's sometimes that's an important part of journalism too.
Well, he is, like you said, your protagonist, and he is wrestling with a story that involves another one of the main characters, the US President, Lawrence G. Lockwood. And what do we need to know about this particular character?
Yeah, so Lockwood is the front runner for a new global position, which I'm calling a dictator in this book. Dictator is a funny term. It's obviously got a very negative meaning, but a lot of this book reaches back into history and pulls it forward. And I'm using dictator in the way that the Romans did, which is somebody who is appointed and given a short-term mandate to pull us out of a crisis. This is what Romans did when the Carthaginians showed up, over the Alps, and at many other times in their history, up until Caesar essentially didn't give power back. But before that, every dictator did. And that was obviously a question in the book itself. If you have a dictator, do they give power back? So Lawrence G. Lockwood is a front runner. Nobody actually expected a former US president to become the front runner. But there he is, but he has a bit of a history, and there are question marks really over his ethics and some of the things that he's done in his life as well. And that certainly is some of the questions that are fed to Tully by a whistleblower, suggesting that Lockwood may have been responsible for the geoengineering the disaster that killed Tully's wife. Not on purpose necessarily, but to save the US from being hit by a heat wave, may have caused it to be deflected elsewhere, where it hit the Persian Gulf, and that was the disaster that killed Tully's wife. And so that, as we open, is essentially where Tully is at, trying to get his head around this new information for the first time in 10 years that has come out, trying to look at investigating a story where, frankly, he is conflicted, but there's no one else to tell this story.
Yeah. And this race for the dictatorship, as you mentioned, Lockwood is going up against another candidate, Governor Solomon. Now, this I imagine was an interesting character to write. Why don't you tell us a little bit about him or it?
Well, I suppose the most important thing about the most important thing about Solomon is he is an AI candidate, and he is currently a governor of a seaborne city-state called New Carthage. There are 6 of these city-states. Actually, is governor of all of them, but we only really meet New Carthage in this story. And the concept here really is that we've reached past the stage of AGI, artificial general intelligence, past what other people would call the singularity, the point at which humankind can kind of control AI directly, and into superintelligence, that you have what is essentially a new type of being, one, albeit that is controlled by humans and has been given kind of guardrails and a mandate, but nonetheless is different to us. Now, Solomon in this race was always seen as a bit of a joke candidate. The Swedes had kind of proposed him, but again, was never particularly expected to get near the last 2 in this race. And obviously, that's a core question around the novel, because would you give up the control of our destiny to AI? Is a scary question for us right now, and it may be one that we have to face down the line. Who knows? We don't really know where this technology will go, and whether it will indeed be one superintelligence or many superintelligences that if we ever get that far at all. But it was a question that I really wanted to explore, and I really wanted to tell a story that wasn't another Terminator, wasn't another kind of AI is evil and will kill us all, but actually showed some of the potential, and some of the downsides, but some of the potential of what we could do with this technology. And Solomon is very straight in this book that he believes that humankind can't save itself, that it will always be too concerned with legacy and re-election and power, to make the hard decisions, and he feels that somebody is going to have to make some tough decisions, that mankind has left it too late to not make those tough decisions, and that he is best placed to do so. And so that essentially is one of the dilemmas really around the book is, humankind versus AI. Who do you trust to get us out of that crisis?
And people will have to read the book to find out how all this turns out. But I want to talk about two other characters in the book. And these, again, we just talked about Governor Solomon, who was not necessarily a traditional character. These other two aren't either, but yet they play important roles in your story. One is the world you have built, the time, the place, the setting for this story. So I want to talk about that. And then I also want to talk about the technology. So that also plays a big role in this book. But let's first talk about this world that you have created in the not too distant future. I'm curious how you went about deciding what it would look like, what the backstory was. In your mind, did you sort of write the history leading up till this point, or did you just paint the picture, period, and then move forward from there? How did the world building take place?
It's a bit of both, I would say. I'm not a massive, massive, massive outliner, although for this story, obviously, I did write pages and pages and pages of notes, I would say, of what ifs and of ideas and thoughts and questions that all found their way into the various different bits. The world itself, I sort of didn't start off and say, look, I want to write a dystopia. It's interesting because actually, as I look at some of my early reviewers and I look at some of the social media chat around the book, people are calling it a dystopia. However, it's all a matter of degree. The island of New Carthage that we encounter, this floating city-state, you could argue is a utopia, although maybe it's only a utopia for the rich and wealthy and the elite that can afford to live on it, which is another theme that gets explored in the book. For everything else, I think both from a world and a tech perspective, really, what I did was try and just extrapolate. I tried to look at where were the trend lines heading, what was the world going to be like, and not just from a temperature and climate perspective, which is the obvious one. Of course, you're writing a book where the world is, on the brink of a climate disaster again, an enormous one, and is collapsing under the weight of it. So obviously, climate had to be a theme within the book, and imagining what that was going to look like takes a variety of forms, both from the core setting, which is London. What would London look like in that state, and some of the other places that they go, but also in terms of basic political stuff. How has the world reached a point where it has actually agreed to elect one single person? Like, how do you even achieve that when the nations can't agree on anything today? So, there's a lot of questions you start to have to ask yourself if you're coming up with an idea like this, and you've got to find compelling, convincing answers to those questions.
And then when you were creating the technology for this book, again, you mentioned that you extrapolated from what we have, what is possible today, and what it might look like shortly down the road. Did you decide on the technology based on what you needed for the story, or was it a case of, in some cases, the technology, even the setting, driving the plot? Chicken or the egg, which comes first?
I'd say it's a bit of both, because obviously there's a lot of technology in the book, and obviously at some points I say, okay, like I need a technology that does this, and so I would look around and see what is possible today, and then try and project that forward. The first principle I had was I call it flying car syndrome. I didn't want a kind of Back to the Future scenario where we imagine that there's going to be flying cars 30 years after the movie comes out, the book comes out, and we get there and there's none, because there was no genesis of flying cars back in 1980 when we started. You couldn't see it really on the horizon. And sometimes, even though we do live in exponential times, but the typical kind of S-curve in technology, the typical time it takes for a new technology to come along, move out into the mainstream and reach maturity is about 20, 25 years. So, I was very keen to make sure that everything that went in the book, I could point at something today and say it's the ancestor of that. So one of the core technologies in the book is called neuroreality, and it is an ancestor of virtual reality, but It is full sensory and it is interfacing directly with your brain. And there is a genesis of that today, both from the ability to read brainwaves and translate them. So Facebook, or Meta, as it's called now, recently showed that they could show somebody an image and they could detect an output image from the brain using magnetic. I can't even pronounce the thing, but they could basically detect the brain waves and they could interpret that back into an image in real time. But also Elon Musk's Neuralink company, which is experimenting with brain chips. So I was looking, even when I was writing the book, at those kind of things and saying, okay, can we imagine a future in which we aren't using the eyes and the ears as our kind of filters to this virtual world, but we can put it straight in the head. That's not particularly unusual from a sci-fi. Well, there have been others that have done that, but it's not a Ready Player One, completely different kind of world. What I wanted to use it was really like an extension of the day-to-day things that we do today, like you and I are doing right now. We're having a Zoom call. I wanted to imagine, what does a Zoom call look like in that kind of world? What does it feel like if you're having a Zoom call in a full sensory, brain-tapped environment? And so all of the stuff within the book that's technological really just is that kind of extrapolation. The other thing, though, that was really the one bit actually I did switch on during the book after consulting some tech experts was screens. It was obviously now, in fact, only a few weeks ago, really, as you listen to this, the first Apple Vision Pro headset has come out, augmented reality, for reinvented again by Apple, of course. Some people would say that others are already there, things like the Meta Quest. But essentially, that is overlaying a computer straight into our visual field. And again, 25 years into the future, well, it's only been 25 years ago. We were just having the internet really come into our lives. And in that time, we have adopted phones and then smartphones. And we're at that stage today where we've got, the smartphone interfaces being able to be projected into our eyes. So I wanted to be able to take that forward and suggest that actually we won't have hard screens at all. And if you think about that, that kind of makes sense. It seems kind of a surprise that in every single science fiction thing you've ever seen that's imagining the world 3,000 years into the future, you're still walking past people looking at monitors fixed on the wall. And I just didn't really believe that was going to be the case.
I'd like to talk a bit about your day job, because I think what you do, your career, lends itself to writing this kind of story. So I'm curious, what did you draw upon in your experience? And were there lessons that you had learned in the business world that you applied to not just writing the story and creating it, but also the business of writing?
I'm a former startup tech CEO. I sold my business to a major food delivery company just before the pandemic. I'm currently involved in a new startup, which we're still kind of in the very experimental early phase of playing with a whole bunch. It's a bit like having a Lego box and deciding what you're going to make from all. You can see all the Lego. You haven't quite decided how it all fits together yet. That's the phase I enjoy the most. I have to be honest. It's much more exciting being there than managing a big team of people around the world. So that was my day job, and for sure it shaped things, particularly as actually part of my job was storytelling, storytelling and painting a vision of the future of this technology, not only to, new investors and new clients and everybody else, but also my team. And of course, we were always looking at where technology was heading and which bits were going to be successful and which bits weren't, so we could make sure that we were investing our own development in the right direction. And so that's definitely a core skill I think I was able to bring into writing a techno-thriller like this. I think the other thing from a business perspective of writing the book, I think the approach I've taken was maybe a little bit unusual in that I like a lot of input. There are some writers who will go off into a hotel for several months and not talk to anyone and come out with a beautiful piece of art. And that's incredible. And that's just not how I could ever imagine myself writing. I need to bounce ideas off people and I need to get feedback and I need to have opposing points of view that I can juggle on, and stuff. So I had a main editor on this that I worked with the whole way through rather than just at the end. But I also bounced it off other editors during the process and had them give their opinion and rip it apart in new ways. And I had a number of different kind of alpha and beta readers. It was very much like a building, in a number of different layers. I liken it a little bit to drawing, or painting. I've been learning to paint as well, and you start with the big shapes and the structure, and you're slowly building up more and more detail with each layer after you've let it dry. And that for me was very much how I created this book. But it required a lot of bouncing and an interrogation by people that really knew their stuff and weren't just going to be nice, but were able to give me their hard, honest opinions as to what was working and what wasn't.
Was there anything that surprised you about this writing journey? Anything that once you got into it, you had no idea that's how things worked, or that's how it would work for you?
Obviously, when you start writing, you learn a lot very, very quickly. And I was determined to kind of take a very accelerated route, having never written really before, at least not since I was a teenager. I mean, I could talk for hours about the industry itself, and there's been a lot of surprises as to how the industry works and how slow some stuff moves and
Mm-hmm.
how old-fashioned a number of things are. I don't really want to kind of to dwell on that and criticize it because to some extent, it is what it is. I think what surprised me most was how once you've learned to write, and I hope by the end of this, I've now just finished my second book, and I'm writing a third and indeed a fourth in parallel. Uh, you become it ruins a number of other storytelling experiences for you. I find it now very, very difficult to read other books and to watch movies without having that kind of judgmental eye on how
Mm-hmm.
things are being done, and that's really a shame. Actually, I'd almost love to turn that off with the flick of a switch and not to be judging it because even stories that I used to love that I'm trying to reread now, I'm sort of getting itchy as I go through it, going, oh, the exposition there is just really handled terribly. Or we watch a movie as we did the other night. We watched the new Mission Impossible movie, and there was this scene where they were trying to explain what was going on to the president, and they had seven people in a room, and each of the seven people said one sentence at a time, going around in some sort of carousel, and that just basically ruined the movie for me. I was just like, you spent all this money on a movie, and that would, my editor would throw a page at me if I did that. So yeah, it's I think that was my biggest surprise. The thing that I didn't expect most was that it would make actually enjoying fiction in my own right that much more challenging.
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of writers have no idea that will happen
Hmm.
when they really start to produce work. But I wanted to ask, you mentioned that you have works in progress. What are your plans for your writing journey? Do you make plans for, say, the rest of the year, the next 5 years, so on, or are you just taking whatever is the biggest, brightest, shiniest idea at the moment and working on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely know what I'm doing over the next few years. I almost have too many stories that I'd love to tell, but of course you can really only pick one at a time to really get deep into. The second book I've written is not a sequel to Artificial Wisdom, very deliberately so, because my editor said, look, first of all, I started to write this well before I was even into the publication phase, and he sort of said, look, if you write a sequel right now, and an editor comes along later in this process and makes you take out a character who features in the sequel, it's just going to mess everything up. And you might end up changing a number of things that affect the ending. So you're just better writing something different. I started to write a second book actually that I got 20,000 words in and said, this is too good a story, and I'm not a good enough writer to write it at this stage in my career. So I'm parking this one for a couple of years. I wrote a different book instead, which is a bit more sci-fi, but I'm really trying to write sci-fi and tech for techno-thriller novels for people that don't normally read sci-fi and techno-thriller novels. I have this kind of idea that there are people like my mum, I would say, who actually really enjoy it when they see it, but would be put off if it featured the guy with a a lightsaber or an alien on the front cover or anything like that. And if I force her into reading stuff like Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, she loves it to bits. But she's put off by this label of sci-fi. It seems alien, to use a better word, to her. So, and actually, I think there's a large segment of readers that actually do really enjoy imagining the future, but are put off by when it gets too far, too fantastical. So I want to write quite grounded stuff, and my new book is very much a action thriller, a crime thriller even, but it just happens to be in a setting which is unusual, and it's not a high tech setting either. In fact, we talked about it's very different to artificial wisdom in that, in a way, the technology is maybe 30, 40 years behind now, even though we're set some stage in the future. So I'm quite excited by this one. I've just got it out to alpha readers. My working title is Futility Town. You heard it here first. And the alpha reader response has been really, really good. But even better than I thought, actually, because I've got to be honest, it was hard to you're putting a artificial wisdom, it will always hold a special place in my heart because it's, I think, quite a complex book, and it's got a lot of twists and turns, and people generally think they see where the ending is going to go, and then they are surprised, hopefully, at the end as to where it ends up. And I knew I couldn't quite recreate that. I couldn't do the same thing again. I needed to do something different. And part of you always goes, well, is this as good? And I think one of my close friends said it best, where he said, look, the ideas in artificial wisdom are bigger, but you've learned to write even better since finishing artificial wisdom, and the way this story flows. He said, you've got something really special here, and it could be 20 books. So yeah, I'm excited by that one. And then I'm essentially right now trying to write sequels to both Futility Town and Artificial Wisdom. And I think Artificial Wisdom the sequel is there'll only be one more sequel of that. And it's going to take a bit of time to write because it's very complicated, and I need to do justice to the complexity of the first one. Whereas Futility Town, I think, that's fairly easy. Not easy, but, I could write stories in that universe much more rapidly because it is much more of an open book as a setting and as a world.
Good. Well, it sounds like you're going to be busy.
Yeah, I like to be busy. I've got too many things going on.
Well, if people want to learn more about you, your books, new releases, all that kind of stuff, where can they go to find you and that information?
I would say follow me on Instagram or Threads or even Twitter, but I'd probably say Instagram and Threads right now at Tom_Weaver. Yes, it's not the same as my author name, Thomas R. Weaver. I'm afraid I was Tom before I was Thomas, but there we go. So at Tom_Weaver. I've got a website, thomasrweaver.com, but you can go and buy the book. We've just put it up. It's ready. At least the ebook and audiobook are ready for pre-order on Amazon.com.
Wonderful. Well, Tom, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with Artificial Wisdom and with your works in progress. We'll look forward to those. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.